You'll remember that from the time of Henry VIII, Roman Catholicism was made illegal in Great Britain, especially in the period of Queen Elizabeth I and thereafter. It was absolutely forbidden and illegal for Catholics to practice the Catholic faith. Anyone who was found supporting a priest or with Catholic emblems they wouldn't just be imprisoned, they wouldn't just be hung. They'd be hung, drawn and quartered and martyred in unthinkable ways, such as St. Philip Howard, the Earl of Arundel, who politely protested to Queen Elizabeth that he wanted to retain the Catholic faith. He was imprisoned, and then when the unfortunate Armada came, he was inevitably beheaded. And it's Philip Howard's Saint's Day today.
We were looking at the altar. There's something...
This is the tabernacle.
Yeah.
Because when the church was first consecrated, this little chapel at the side here was dedicated as the Blessed Sacrament Chapel, and it's still called the Blessed Sacrament Chapel. But there's correspondence from Pugin where Pugin says that the tabernacle arrangement is not worthy in such a fine church. So this fine tabernacle must have been put in the late 1850s, and it would have been the work of a Birmingham company called Hardman's.
And what does the tabernacle represent?
The tabernacle means a dwelling place, doesn't it, in the Old Testament scriptures? It's the place where God lives among men. So it's the place where Catholics reserve the Blessed Sacrament, not just as a symbol, but as an actual reality of Christ's dwelling among his people. So the tabernacle is the most sacred object in any Catholic church, together with the altar, of course, because the altar is the place of Christ's sacrifice. But the tabernacle is where the consecrated bread and wine are stored perpetually as a sign of Christ's perpetual indwelling of every sacred church and dwelling among his people. And it goes back to Old Testament themes of God himself tabernacling among his people in the Old Testament in the desert. That's why it's called a tabernacle.
But you actually store the bread that you use in the...
Yes, from the Mass.
From the Mass, okay.
That's the most important feature in any Catholic church. And it is the defining, I don't want to call it a symbol, it's the defining feature of Catholic life and worship, because we believe that Christ is really, truly present among us in the fullness of his own flesh and blood. And Catholicism is a very, very intimate faith, and that faith and conviction go right back to apostolic times, to the first century, because first century writers speak about the flesh and blood of Christ that is shared when they come together in the Eucharist. You know, this was the teaching of the early church. It wasn't a kind of development of doctrine. It was integral to the tradition received from the apostles, and that's why even in late first century, the early Christians are accused of cannibalism because they're eating flesh and blood.
Yeah.
And so the urgency of this faith.
So this is, and forgive me if I say anything
Go
wrong,
on.
or particularly if I say anything offensive, just go.
No.
But critically for you, it's not a metaphor. It's not just a metaphor.
No,
it's a literal embodiment.
It's the physical presence of Christ's indwelling among his people, and his promise is true. This is my bread, this is my body, this is my blood. Behold, I'm with you always, even to the end of the world. And for Catholics, and no less for Orthodox, although their tradition is slightly different, for the Eastern churches always keep the consecrated body and blood of the liturgy in a sacred place in the church.
And that doesn't happen in the Church of England? Some cases it
depends who you speak to.
Yeah.
If you go into...
It's a broad church. If
you go into Anglo-Catholic churches, you will find a tabernacle just the same way, and Anglo-Catholic priests and people would reverence the sacrament in just the same way, except the 39 articles are compromised in the process, because the 39 articles make it clear that according to Protestant tradition that the bread and wine is not to be carried around and worshipped, but that's part of their tradition, and certainly not part of the tradition that the Catholic Church has celebrated since the time of the apostles. So the church was consecrated in 1851, and there was a great first Mass ceremony when Pugin and Wardell were present. If you remember, I said that Wardell did all the stonework. So Wardell had already put up the tracery, in other words, the skeleton of the window. And if you look at it, you realize in the upper part is actually a Star of David look. It's a Star of David which has been turned 30 degrees or something. So it's a Star of David, but turned so you don't quite recognize it straight away as the Star of David.
Yeah.
So he's using the Star of David as a religious theme, but now he's applying it to the Virgin Mary. And so Wardell had left the stonework in place. By the time that Pugin took responsibility for the projects and designed the windows, so Pugin designs the glasswork themselves, but he curses Wardell because he says the tracery is so impossible to work with that it's impossible to get a consistent theme because some of the apertures are smaller than a man's hand.
Yes.
And he despaired of getting a consistent theme in the glass. But what he's done with the Star of David, he's made a reference to the book of the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah has a vision and he says, he gazes into heaven and he literally sees God. And you get to the 6th chapter of Isaiah and you think, well, what did he say? What did he saw God. What did he see? What did he say? And it says, he was behind the seraphim. With 2 he covered his face. With 2 he covered his feet. And with 2 he flew. And you think, okay, so you kind of saw God, but he was hidden behind these great angels, and it was all part of the mystery. So Pugin is using the Star of David as an opportunity to give us the 6 seraphim, and he's saying that when you come into this church and the Blessed Sacrament is before your eyes, you are literally coming in to meet with God. You are literally coming in to meet with God.
I see.
And that is the essence of Catholic liturgy and worship, and it's all contained in this tableau here. Sometimes when we have school kids here, it's nice to set them a little task and say, how many angels can you see in this church? Because there's literally hundreds.
Is this a normal amount for a Catholic church? There's definitely more than in the Anglican ones I've been in.
But I think Pugin didn't do things by halves, did he? Pugin was kind of saying, we're going to bring you Catholicism, so get this, this.
We've got 2 guys on.
Yeah, they're more recent. They're more recent, but these are the patron saints of the Archdiocese of Southwark, who are, of course, St. Thomas More, who was the king's personal friend, but who died for his faith because he refused to submit to the Act of Supremacy, and he insisted that the church cannot be divided and a king cannot be the head of the church. John Fisher, he's the Bishop of Rochester. He was, alongside Thomas More, he was the leading Catholic intellectual, and he was the only one among the bishops at the time that had the courage to stand out and say, with all due respect, Your Majesty, we cannot divide the church, and a king can never be supreme head of the church. Yeah. Only the bishops in communion with the Bishop of Rome as successor of Peter. You can't make a king the head of that is the principal dividing factor between Anglicanism and Catholicism, that the Anglican Church is part of the mechanism of the state, and even today the prayer book has to be authorised by the British government, which is part of a nonsense today, and they would say it's just a courtesy, but in reality, and that's not to diminish anything from Her Majesty the Queen and the beauty of the coronation, but Anglicanism is part of the mechanism of the British state.
So let me play devil's advocate on this, because I've got no stake in this game.
Yeah, sure.
Ultimately, it's about the revealed relationship between God and the individual.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the church is a mechanism to
Yes.
transport that message
Yes.
and to help educate and bring you to a state of mind that does that stuff.
Yes.
Yep. There's certain things.
Yes.
That organisation kind of is, as long as it's doing that job, the particular organisation isn't terribly important. And let me give you the concrete example where I suspect maybe you and I politically might see some differences. And that is, there are women priests, women vicars now in the Anglican Church, and I think that arose directly because of the way the Anglican Church is organised. And obviously it caused a big old ruckus in the Anglican Church, but ultimately it's led to something which my liberal instincts would say this is a positive thing, where you have equality in terms of delivering that message. Even if I have no stake in the game, that just seems to be like a good thing. But that's not where the Catholic Church is at the moment.
No. The Catholic Church was delivered it comes from Christ through the apostles, and while the faith of the Church develops with the passage of time, it develops in the context of what's already within its tradition. And the whole subject of human sexuality is the most divisive issue, and it touches now not just on things like the ordination of women, but it's touching on the definition of marriage. And
there's been a recent change, hasn't there, with blessings to gay couples? Or hasn't there? You tell me.
In the Church of England?
I thought in the Catholic Church.
God bless the Pope. The Pope is simply trying to find the pastoral vocabulary to keep people within the Church's embrace and to love them and give them a valid place and dignity. Christian marriage is an everlasting bond between a man and a woman for the mutual comfort of the two partners and for the gift of children, for children to be raised by in normal circumstances, by two parents of opposite genders in a safe and loving environment. And that's what marriage is. And the marriage hasn't happened until the marriage has been consummated by sexual intercourse. Now, we've got to ask how is a marriage between two people of the same sex consummated? Because in English, in civil law, if the consummation hasn't happened, then neither has the marriage. So that's above my pay grade to determine how same-sex couples actually legally consummate the marriage. I'm not competent to comment on
but that's one of the things that makes it difficult.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the Catholic Church would still want to say that the two genders are complementary. We're equal, we're complementary, we're not the same. And to simply see priesthood in the functional term of, well, a woman can run an organisation just as well as a man, that's absolutely true. But when the priest stands at the altar, he completes a tableau of the Last Supper in which, for those moments, he is in the role of Christ. Now, our Eastern friends would say, very without any compromise, and Christ was male. And for signs and symbols to be accurate, they need to be what they are. Christ was male, and if the priest doesn't have to be male, then we're actually saying, well, we don't know what gender Christ was, and that puts doubts on the whole doctrine of the incarnation and in what sense Christ was ever really human anyway. Because if God had sent a daughter to redeem the world, we would have women priests, and they'd be standing at the altar now saying, we're sick of standing up here, we want men to be priests, and the men would say, but he sent a daughter.
Yeah, but he also sent a Jew, and he also sent someone from the region of Palestine, and you don't need to be a Palestinian to do that. I'm interested that you're focusing on that detail and saying that's the thing that we have to...
I suppose it depends what things are peripheral and secondary to and the Catholic Church would say, well,
this is important.
The incarnation. God sent his son. It doesn't say he sent a Palestinian or he sent a Jew. God sent his own son. That's the faith of the church. And when the priest stands at the altar, he completes the tableau. And by definition, the priest has to be male. And if there was evidence in the traditions of the church that, there had been women priests, and some would try to make that argument, but I'm far from convinced about that, that Junius was an apostle, whether Junius was a female name, and whether that meant that she stood to celebrate the Eucharist. That's all a very, very tenuous discussion that some would say has been suppressed by the patriarchal, bullies.
What I've kind of found interesting in this conversation is, and having talked to a number of vicars, is you've definitely represented more beef about the differences between Anglican and Anglicanism.
Well, because
whereas the Anglicans I talked to, they're very, if only the Catholics...
You've got to remember that I'm a former Anglican myself.
Yes,
and that I broke my heart over and I still break my heart about these things because I've always described myself as a reluctant convert. Because I received ordination in the Church of England in good conscience and good faith. I was ordained in the Church of England the year that Pope John Paul came to Britain in 1982. And and the only way that I've ever been able to make sense of Christianity is through the prism, ISM, through the prism of Catholicism. Protestantism begins in the 1500s, in the 16th century. Catholicism goes back to the beginning. And sure, it's unfolded and developed through time, but it's only developed in the context of what it already had from the beginning. The wise scribe is the man who brings out of his treasury things old and things new.
So what was the actual mechanism whereby you went from being a Anglican priest to a Catholic priest, and you ended up here? If you did.
I went to prison on the way, but
you didn't.
As a chaplain. I was chaplain to Belmarsh Prison for 11 years.
Okay.
And so I had 15 years working in the prisons. But I offered to do that. It wasn't where I was sent to. I actually volunteered and offered for that ministry. And
that was a Catholic ministry or an Anglican
That was
ministry?
a Catholic ministry,
okay.
yeah.
So does that mean within Belmarsh there's also an Anglican ministry?
Yes, and a Catholic.
Do you share a chapel, or is it?
Yes, there's a shared chapel which is now shared by the Muslims as well, and that's another. We'll go off on a completely different tangent then if we go. Let's stay off the prison subject.
Okay.
Because it was both a joy and a crucifixion. But that's the nature of the ministry. What were we talking about?
I was talking about the mechanism to...
Yeah. Oh, how
you became a... Yeah. Did someone someone in authority have to say, okay? Well, they must have done.
Of course, yeah. I probably was aware of a vocation to ministry, I would have said as a vicar, from 7 or 8 years old when I was singing in a choir like your son, singing, Lead me, Lord, lead me in thy righteousness, make thy way plain before my... And singing that from 8 years old, and then at about 12 years old, realising that this was going to be my life. I was going to be, in a mixed up, confused, childish way, I would have said, to be a vicar. And
when you sing that song, are you actually identifying a moment where you remember something happening in your head
definitely.
while you were singing?
Yeah.
8
years old, 7 or 8 years old. I came home from school late one afternoon. I'd left some photographs in the church, and the church was always locked, but this afternoon it was open, and I thought I could nip in and get those pictures I've left in the vestry. And the old vicar was there after a funeral, and said, "Oh, Kevin, what do you think of doing when you leave school?" And I said, "Oh, I thought I'd be a vicar." I said, we had another priest in the parish who was extreme Anglo-Catholic, and he said straight, "Well, if you're thinking like that, you need to go and speak to Father Ramsey." I thought, well, who's Father Ramsey? He'd just arrived, and he was this extreme Anglo-Catholic priest that was the kindliest and most comical and eccentric man, and he was a religious studies teacher in a selective grammar school, and he just took me under his wing and fostered me into, and I was accepted to train, to everybody's astonishment, at 18 years old. And when the old bishop...
Is that early then?
Apparently so, yeah.
Okay.
I was on the bishop's books from when I was 15, and he sent me to in the Church of England you have to go to a selection conference. I think you have to be 21 now, 22. But he sent me the month after my 18th birthday, and to everybody's astonishment, the conference recommended me, and I went back to see the old bishop, and he said, "You've been recommended. You're now officially an ordain for the priesthood in the area of Edmonton." And I said, "Well, what else did they say?" And he said they said rather a lot. He said, "I'm not going to read it, so I'm going to read you one line that the selectors think that you have rather more ability than what your school teachers credit you with." God only knows. I went to this big boys' comprehensive school where the head teacher was an atheist, and I screwed up all my GCSEs big time, absolute. And the head teacher wouldn't have me into the sixth form. My dad had to go and play. And he said to my dad, "I will accept him into the sixth form if he thinks sensibly about the future, because the only reason he says he's going to be a vicar is because it gets him attention. Kids call him God." And so head teacher looked at me and said, "So what are you actually going to do, Kevin?" And that was the best trigger, because of pure defiance. And I looked at him and I said, "I've told you what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a vicar." And he looked at my dad and said, my dad said, "I think he's going to be a vicar." And when people ask me, "Well, why did you become a priest?" I said, "I did it for devilment, just to piss off the head teacher." But I'm still...
You're still here.
I'm still in the game. I've still got skin in the game, just about. I've still got skin in the game. But from the moment of my ordination, I was profoundly committed to the task of Catholic reconciliation. I thought that, especially with the Pope coming to Britain in 1982, I thought that we would be in the vanguard of a reconciliation, and that, and even now I grieve over this, because it's absolutely absurd that we've got St Alfred's Church down the road there conducting the same ceremony, albeit with a different faith and sentiment behind it, but the same actions. You go to a little town like Barmouth, where I like to go stay with a mate up there. There's 15 churches, 15 churches, and they're all splinter groups of non-conformist chapels, but the Catholics are there. There's 2 Anglican churches, there's various Methodist churches. You say, this is the product of the Reformation. It just fragmented the church into 1,000 splinter pieces, all rivaling with each other that they've got the true faith, and yet all of it comes from the 1550s.
But you're the embodiment, though, of the fact that there's a moment where with this thing I will not put up with.
Yeah.
So there's.
Yeah.
So you must see why that happens, because ultimately you made that big that big, profound challenge.
I think we have to look at the faith, how it was delivered, how it unfolded within the lifetime of the apostles, by the turn of the first century. By the turn of the first century, so that Ignatius of Antioch was writing, where the bishop is, there is the Catholic Church. And he was the first one to use the term Catholic, because there were all these spurious cults and imitation Gnostic cults and communities being set up. So if you were a traveller or a merchant and you had your faith, you wanted to know, when I go to Ephesus or when I go to Damascus, which is that? And you think, where the bishop is, there is the Catholic Church. And the bishop is the one who was entrusted by the apostles in succession to safeguard the faith and say, this is what we learned, this is what we learned from Peter, John, Paul, and this is what they learned from Christ. Yeah. And if we've got any conflicts about it, the bishops will talk to each other and say, no, that's off the beat, but this is part of the tradition. Yeah, so you can't, it's not that you can't deviate from that, but you can't set that aside. You can't set it all aside and say, well, none of that counts for anything, because in that case, I mean, what Protestantism is that Protestantism is as many people who read the Bible and interpret for themselves about what they feel it means. You think, well, it's not.
I'm not sure the Protestants would necessarily say that.
Well, I'd embrace that discussion. I'd embrace that discussion. Come and tell me, from the Jehovah's Witnesses to the Mormons and the Christian Scientists, all the way through to liberal Anglicanism. Tell me what, because, and what grieves me more than anything is that what is always thrown at the Catholic Church, well, the Catholic Church was so corrupt because look at all these indulgences and sure, and rightly so, and that needed reform, and it was reformed. It was reformed pretty quick as well. But now the Protestant churches have given rise to the prosperity gospel. Sow your seed and God will reward you financially. You switch on the telly and all these televangelist channels, and all you get is blatant, in your face, prosperity gospels, Sow your seed and God will reward you 100 times. Send your money to us and... Yeah. I have no... And when
for I don't understand that either.
And when Protestants are so quick to say, but it was because of the indulgences, I say, look, friends, you got your own problem now, and you haven't got a mechanism to deal with it. The Catholic Church had a mechanism to deal with that, and it was dealt with, and rightly so. But you deal with the prosperity gospel because it's out of control and it's not Christian, and I have no part in it. Anyway, I'm getting fired up. And at the end of St. John's Gospel, there's this little enigmatic reference which says where it's the final scene of the resurrection, where the disciples, Christ has appeared on the shore of the sea, and they've had breakfast together, and they're walking, and Christ says to Peter, do you love me? 3 times, blah, blah, blah. And then he says, when you were young, you walked where you would, but when you were older, someone will take a girdle and put it round, a belt and put it round your waist and take you where you do not wish to go, which is Rome. And that was the same voice that kept waking me in the middle of the night when I was a 35-year-old Anglican priest. I'd wake up with all this stuff going round and round in my head, Catholic, Anglican, loyalty, who do I serve, where do I belong? Yeah. And this voice would say, when you were young, you walked where you would, and when you were older, someone else will put a belt around your waist and take you where you want, which is Rome. And I just knew I had to become Roman Catholic, and that was Catholic, I would prefer to say now, really. So what Pugin and Wardell are really doing, they're taking so many images of English Catholicism and they're thrusting it right in the face of the British establishment to say, you've forgotten how English Catholicism actually is.
Do you feel that there's a certain fate about you ending up on this church?
Yes, I love being here.